I've got a really, really great debate. It might be more of a moderated conversation, really, but it's featuring Douglas Murray, one of the greatest minds of our time, and he's in Qatar speaking on and debating the global refugee crisis. And of course, like any good debate these days, the side that has actual facts and actual evidence on their side not only has to debate their opponent, but they have to debate the moderator as well. And in this case, the moderator, man, it is a total ambush. And Douglas handles it better than I think probably anyone else could. And this is a long one, guys, but I promise you this is an important one. So stick around to the end. It's worth it. It's a really, really good one. So he's debating a guy named Mark Lamont Hill, who is a real smart guy, actually, for being honest. He's an accomplished guy, but he is also one of the most radical cultural Marxists of our time. And like any good cultural Marxist, he actually makes it all sound kind of pretty.
Talk about refugees as a crisis is to ask the wrong question at the wrong time. Rather than beginning with the entirely reasonable question of what do we do with these people who have arrived here, we must first ask an equally reasonable but far more urgent question. What are the social, cultural, economic, and intellectual conditions that led these people to our doors? Before we deliberate about what to do with Mexicans at the southern U.S. border, many of whom assume a de facto refugee status, we must instead consider the trade agreements and exploitative labor practices that actively undermine the possibility of prosperity within Mexico. Prior to wrestling with the question of Syrian refugees, we have to answer the years of American foreign policy, and we have to consider the years of American foreign policy that have helped to destabilize the region. By framing the issue differently, we not only become more intellectually honest, but we're also better equipped to arrive at sustainable solutions. To solve the refugee issue, we must first commit to reimagining citizenship in more interesting, dynamic, and practical ways. We must also consider the crisis of memory. Far too often, the people clamoring to close the borders forget that they themselves were beneficiaries of openness, either as former refugees or otherwise desperate immigrants looking for new possibilities in a new land. Rather than closing the door behind us once we've safely passed through the door, we must do the difficult but necessary work of creating sites of safety for those who come after us. We must remember who we are. We must also remember the horrors that have occurred when we have failed to properly tend to refugees. Consider, for example, in the 1930s, when the US and Europe refused to provide refugee status to Jewish brothers and sisters, desperately fleeing Nazi Germany. Our moral failure contributed to one of the greatest atrocities in human history. We cannot repeat such acts of moral indifference and outright evil by failing to remember our mistakes. Speaking of mistakes, we must take seriously the question and the crisis of supremacy. Simply put, we live in a world where we believe that some lives are inherently worth more than others. This belief, undergirded by white supremacy, Orientalism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, allows us to view some lives as worthy of protection and others as disposable. It allows us to see some cultures as compatible with our society and others as an inherent threat to our way of life. This doesn't mean that there aren't real and tangible political and cultural differences that we must consider. We must do that. But even those differences can't be properly understood or reckoned with until we address our core biases. And speaking of biases, we must tackle the crisis of representation, particularly in the media. The media, both traditional and new forms, offers most citizens their window into the human experience. The media shapes how we identify and assess social problems. The media gives us a sense of what our available solutions are. The media tells us whose lives matter and whose don't. As long as we are beholden to a narrow range of corporate media sources, themselves committed to a narrow range of ideas and shot through with the very biases that I just referred to, we will struggle to think outside the constraints of the current moment. So, what do we do? The million-dollar question that all academics hate to answer. We must resist. We must address each of these crises with the belief that organized people can and do defeat organized power. That means we vote, we march, we think, we boycott, we teach, we write, we sing, we debate, all in ways that undermine the current power structure and create the possibility for freedom and safety for refugees around the world.
I didn't even want to break into that because if we're being honest, the guy actually makes some pretty decent points. Unfortunately, they're some of his only actually decent points of the entire debate. But I mean, here's the thing, man. Even even if we concede all that, even if horrible foreign policy designed by Washington swamp creatures of both stripes, right? All stripes. Even if that is to blame for lower quality of life in places like Honduras, or even if you concede that Western wars in places like Afghanistan really are to blame for every problem the entire region has ever had or will ever have, even if those things are true, they're obviously not, but even if we concede that they are, does that really mean that we should just accept people clinging to the side of American jets during the most successful airlift operation in history? Or does it really mean that we're somehow bound to incentivize and support millions and millions and millions of people traveling the most dangerous land migration route in all of human history? I don't think so. But the average leftist pretends to believe that. And I can promise you a guy that does not believe that is Douglas Murray. I mean, he literally wrote the book on it.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you here in Doha. I've been traveling across several continents in recent years, not just to the countries that people are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. And we can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this. Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well, adapt well, and what the proportions are that start to make that integration, that adaptation far harder. We have thought very little about this, and what thinking there has been pretty bad. Let me give you another example of something we need to think about. How do we deal with a question this serious in the age of social media? An age when a single photograph of a single person can go all around the world, and everybody sees it, and everybody says something must be done. And their politicians think, I've got to do something. And then they do something, and the public say, no, that wasn't the something we were thinking of. We've thought of something else, but we don't know what. How do we live in that world? How do politicians act in that world? How do we have any form of political leadership in that world? How do we work out what the right thing to do is in that world? Not just in the short term, but in the long term too. Let me give you a 5th question. How do we ensure that we're able to have a serious and deep debate about these issues, and that we're able to allow people to express legitimate concerns and have that debate without those legitimate concerns being dismissed as xenophobic, nativist, and so on? how do we work out where that might be the case? And how do we work out where it's not, where there are legitimate fears? Sixth question, how do we overcome fatalism? The fatalism you hear everywhere these days, sometimes in the spirit of optimism. This is the world as it is now. People move. This is globalization. Get used to it. Suck it up. Don't complain. How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that? Now, I've got, rather unsurprisingly, fewer answers than I've got questions. But let me give you just 3 answers I would suggest that we could hold on to as the beginning of a set of answers to this. The first is, hold a very clear line between people fleeing for their lives from war zones and people fleeing economic deprivation. Find and hold to a very clear line on it. If you do not, I predict with absolute certainty that you will continue to erode public sympathy with people who need the sympathy the most, because these things will be rubbed together and elided. So I would suggest, first of all, find that and hold on to it pretty close. Second thing I would suggest, find a broad level of agreement, and there is a lot of this internationally now, that the best way to cope with the most serious situations is to keep people roughly in the area of the country for which they fled. It's much easier to look after them there. It's much easier to get international aid there. My own country, Great Britain, is, I think, the second largest donor of international aid within the regions of Syria. That should, I think, be one of the models for this, that we make sure that we don't have this idea that some people have that you disperse X percentage there and X percentage there and put these people there. Thirdly, I would say make sure you increase economic productivity in refugee camps. Make sure people have a hope and a purpose and a work life when they're outside of their country. Look, I'm concluding with this because otherwise the music will get so loud you won't hear me. There are no simple answers to this because there are no simple questions in this. This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far.
As always, man, just perfectly put. And he's absolutely right. I mean, the opposite ends of the immigration spectrum are both complete and total fantasies, right? You cannot stop immigration completely. You just can't. And you can't invite or allow anyone and everyone to come. I mean, it's just not possible. What we have to want, what we have to strive for, what needs to happen is something right down the middle, something that we can somehow agree on. And that's the difficult part, he says. And he's absolutely right. Arguing about all this stuff is easy. I mean, all the questions that Douglas raised are smart. They're all important questions, but he's right. Every single serious question or concern that even comes near the same zip code as immigration always gets dismissed by the left, especially. In the same way, every time, as racist or xenophobic or nativist or Yahtzee this or Yahtzee that or whatever, every single time without fail. So the real question of our time isn't really how to solve any of this stuff. It's how do you even freaking talk about it, right? And part of that talk, again, he's right. We have no serious answers because no one is asking serious questions. And just like he said, all they do is start calling people who don't fully agree, don't fully toe the line, this is or that ism. And it's true. There's no denying it. Everything he said, every question he asked is completely spot on. And then here comes the host. I mean, she's going to prove every single thing he said correct. And I'll keep going, guys. But if you appreciate this content, make sure to hit the like button and to subscribe. Really, really does help. It goes a long way to helping the channel grow.
Right. Douglas Murray, thank you very much. A few provocative thoughts, no doubt, that you mentioned there. A few jumped at me, such as when you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. You seem to conveniently forget that the developed world moved to the developing world without asking permission.
No, I don't.
It seems to me as well that this is a particularly Western-centric viewpoint, and a misleading one at that, because you know as well as I do, and the figures show it, 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, settle in neighboring countries in the Middle East,
Sure.
in Africa and Asia. They do not rush over to Europe.
Sure. You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism.
You don't seem to address it in any
I'd
way.
also suggest, by the way, that I don't know how long we're going to go on about colonialism for. I'm happy to do it as long as you like, but let me
don't we
just...
have to be factful, though? Don't we have to be
But also, don't think,
careful about
don't
facts,
think, if I
about
may say
history?
so, that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire? Do we say that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with
That's not the
Islam?
issue.
You brought up colonialism.
You are talking about the Western view that they should stay where they belong.
I'm saying that it seems to me to be much wiser that if you have a very large humanitarian crisis in, for instance, Syria, you try to make sure that people remain in the area. This isn't say all of them, but it is more likely. I absolutely agree they do. I've seen it firsthand.
Look at Turkey, 3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What
the
I'm
countries that have
suggesting
the
to you
most. In
is-
fact, in Lebanon, you've got 1 in every 4 person living in that country is a Syrian refugee.
Absolutely.
So to suggest they're not doing very much is just being misleading, being dishonest.
Believe me, I'm not being misleading. And I said from the outset that I agree with the point that most refugees remain in the area. And I said that I think that that's a good idea. I'm suggesting to you that I think it's better that people, for instance, fleeing Syria, end up in the countries around Syria in order to be able to return to their country than putting them in
but
Norway.
they will return. You are suggesting that they don't want to return. Who in their right
I'm not
mind, if
suggesting
they
they
had
don't
the
want to return.
option,
When did I
and
say
we will
that?
hear from a refugee, if they had the option to return, of course they'd want to return.
I didn't say they wouldn't.
They leave everything behind. But you seem to also be oblivious to another important fact that I just want to throw at you before we go to a video clip that I want to show you. It's what about the moral responsibility, though, of Western countries that have contributed to the destabilization of the region, the meddling, the military interventions, not to mention the arms sales that continue as we speak? What about
Do you want me to answer that? Okay, I'll answer that one frankly. Nobody denies, for instance, the disaster of Iraq. But who are the people who intervened most in Syria?
Isn't just Iraq.
Hang on. Let me answer it. Who intervened most in Syria? It wasn't America. It wasn't Britain. It's Iran, Russia. It's, among others, countries, including the one we're in and others
You're
around
deflecting.
the Gulf
Before
here.
we got to
Let's
Syria,
face
we
it,
had
that
Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in this
instances.
neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
Well, you're also
so do
pouring
you want to
money
take
at
some
it, aren't you?
responsibility for that?
I
Do you want to
think-
take more
I think
refugees
blame
here
can
in Qatar?
certainly
Do you
can
want to
go
take
around.
more in the Gulf?
No one
Right.
is immune to any sort of criticism.
well,
but we're talking
I'm
about
glad to
the
hear it.
Western countries, the British countries, the British
What
countries.
did Britain do in Syria?
We're talking about these governments that you seem to suggest should be immune.
No,
or
when
should
did I
be
suggest that?
absolved of any
When
responsibility.
did I suggest that?
I want to get to the other point that you make, and it's an important one, Douglas Murray. You suggest that we need to actually balance between two very important virtues, two important concepts of mercy toward the refugee and justice toward your own citizens. Let's take a quick look at this instance involving refugees.
Do you send anyone for us? We are the Syrians, about 300.
Sir, I give you the number of Malta authority because you are near Malta.
Hello.
Yes.
About 100 children and 100 women and maybe 100 men. Please hurry. Water is coming into it. The boat is going down. We are dying. 300
Yes, you
children.
have called Malta. You have called Malta.
Don't throw us. You can run away.
Call Malta. Call
I
Malta.
have no enough account on the mobile. It will cut. Please. You have
Yes.
my number now. You call me, please.
A very chilling video, though I don't suggest that you respond on behalf of the Coast Guard, the Italian Coast Guard. But again, it's that same issue of shifting the problem to others. And just for a little bit of context, in fact, this boat, which capsized 5 hours after this call, killing quite a few people on board, we heard that there were about 100 women, 100 children on board, that was twice as close to an Italian island as it was to Malta. But again, this idea that, we have to safeguard our values, where does mercy fit in that? Not just mercy, but the obligation, the legal obligations of states toward refugees.
I'd suggest that we all make sure we don't shift responsibility. There is a responsibility to everyone. That would include the state we're standing in now, wouldn't it? It would include all the states in this region. It would include the brother states. It would include the Ummah. It would include everybody. It wouldn't just be the Italians. Now, the Italians, by the way, and let me just finish this point.
That's a valid issue, but let me respond to it.
Let me
because you
finish
mentioned
the
the states of
point.
the region. It's a valid issue. But unlike the European countries, allow me to just make this point. Unlike the European countries,
I'll respond to 2 points.
They are not parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the legal
Conveniently.
obligations are, well, it's just a fact.
Conveniently, isn't it?
But I'll let you carry on.
But this means that countries that are signatories to the refugee conventions get more blame and more assumption that they are going to have to hold more of the burden than countries that didn't. And I'm suggesting to you that nobody should be should be able to absolve themselves from blame. But if you go to Italy now, and I don't know when you were last there, but it is not the case that this is going well in Italy, either for the migrants who are arriving or for the Italian population.
Isn't it
You
because
don't
the
see these
resources are
people
not being
coming
poured
up.
into this? Let's face it, the policies are not there, the resources aren't there. It
I
isn't
see
about the
these
overwhelming
people when they
numbers.
arrive. I follow their stories. It is not the case just that they don't. The local populations in Italy I've been to Lampedusa. I've seen the boats coming in. The local populations are extremely generous. They are extremely kind to the people. Most of the populations in Europe. Let's just not have this idea that Europeans are somehow incredibly cold-hearted.
No, no one is
Countries in
suggesting
Europe have
that, but
taken in
just
a
putting
lot
the
of people,
numbers
and they are
in-
trying to deal with a very big problem very swiftly.
But just putting the numbers in context, let me just mention
sure.
this very briefly. 3 million people sought asylum in Europe between 2015 and 2016. That's a fraction of the population of Europe, which is 508 million.
And
isn't it?
Germany and Sweden took in 3% of the population in 1 year alone.
They did.
So we're not talking about negligible numbers, and
No,
you shouldn't pretend that
not
we are.
across the board, certainly. Douglas Murray, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So basically, the countries that are nearest to the crisis but didn't sign a treaty 70 years ago share no responsibility and literally receive zero blame for many of these insane leftists, right? But the countries that did sign a treaty are fully and completely responsible, not just to welcome and feed and clothe and protect every immigrant of the world, but also responsible for the fact that these people are even refugees to begin with. And the only reason that things are going so poorly in these countries within the refugee population and the locals that accept them at the same time isn't because it's an impossible task and a completely unsustainable problem, but it's because these places just aren't spending enough money. They aren't offering enough resources. I hope you caught all that. This is how these people think. This is who these people are. Liberal logic is apparently flawed in every single corner of the entire world. And it's pretty damn remarkable stuff, man. And that's beside the point that she's the freaking host. And all she did there was show bias, insult the guy, and then play some terrible clip that is supposed to mean that Douglas's position on immigration is the same thing as letting a boat full of people sink. It just doesn't make sense. They want you to believe that Europe is heartless. And of course they're not. Europe was very, very welcoming. And I promise you, they're absolutely experiencing the consequences of that right now.
Rida, actually, one thing that I noticed on Twitter, people engaged a lot with what you said directly to Douglas Murray. I think you made the point that you said you must be forgetting, you said, that the developed world moved into the developing world without their permission. That's got a lot of tweets, GIFs, and memes that have been circulating online. So we've got a lot of engagement. I still want to know what you think. Twitter, #DearWorld. Get in touch with me and I'll read your comments online. Rida, back
Thanks
to you.
so much, Nilufar. Very interesting to hear. We'll come back to you, of course, a little later. But I understand we have the results. Let's put them up and see how the different statements have played out with our audience, both here and online. Do we have a clear winner, so to speak? Well, we've got a couple of positions that got more than the third one. Resist, power, pushback. That was Mark Lamont Hill. That's almost 40% of your votes. Then education, hope. What we heard from Muzun, about 34.7% of the vote. And keep justice and mercy in balance. Some people have bought into this argument, Douglas Murray, some haven't, as you might expect. But quite a close call, though, I have to say. It wasn't like one statement or one argument won over everyone's votes.
I'm not entirely sure what her point is here. She says there's something called democracy, something called election. That's got nothing to do with his point. His point was you can blame the free countries. You can blame the countries with those elections all you want. You can blame them all you want. You can blame America. You can blame Europe. You can demand things from these countries all you want till you're blue in the face, but it solves nothing and it affects even less. What he's asking is, with all that, what can you do to affect the places that actually have real abuses? The Irans of the world, the Russias, North Korea, much of Africa. Nothing. You can't do anything. Just empty words and platitudes from the left or anyone. They accomplish absolutely nothing. All the bad policy the West can offer, they actually do nothing. But that's exactly what these people really want. They don't want anything solved. They truly only want destruction. Like I said, many of them They don't even know that that's the plan, but that's exactly what they're fighting for. They want to flood the West until the West, as we know it, isn't even recognizable, till it does not exist.
Yeah, I'm Hamad Abu Hawash. I'm a senior at Georgetown University. And my question is to Mr. Douglas Murray. And before I ask my question, I just want to say, you said no sound bites, but then you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. I don't know what that's about.
I said it before.
My question is, since you brought up migration from the developing world, I'd like to ask you this. Every year, the developed world sends about $300 billion of aid to the developing world, but the developing world sends back trillions in debt repayments to the developed world. Now, don't you think that this is the main reason why migrants are moving to Europe? Because money is moving out of the developing world. Wealth is leaving the developing world and moving to the developed world, to build on what Lamont Hill said. Don't you think this is why people are moving to the Western world, to the developed world?
Well, no, I don't. Again, I repeat the fact there are no simple answers. And if it was simply the fact that you could, I don't know, do a debt default or something and solve the whole migration issue, then that would be great. But it just isn't the case. You think that if for instance, all African countries were allowed to default on debt, that they'd become burgeoning, flourishing societies? You think that the problem across, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa isn't just unbelievable greed and theft by politician after politician? You think that if you just wrote off the debt, that would stop being an issue and everyone would become transparent and clean in their dealings with money? I mean, the problems are much deeper than this. They're much deeper than just a simple solution like that. As, if I may just add quickly to the previous two comments, the late, very distinguished American diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful rule he came up with, known as Moynihan's Law, where he said that human rights, claims of human rights violations often happen in exactly inverse proportion to human rights violations. That is, you hear about them in the countries that are most free. And before long, you can end up with the presumption that the most free countries are the ones who are most abusive of human rights. And this happens with the case when we talk about our leaders and the ones, it's all very well. We can talk about the Trump administration, we can talk about the democracies and so on for all we like. We can all make criticisms, and we all should. But, okay,
briefly,
Mr. Putin, what are you going to do about him? What are you going to do about the mullahs in Iran? What are you going to do about the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia? You see, what we end up with is this situation. We go, oh, Mr. Trump. We can all do that. Believe me, I can riff on Trump
again, you're being
all
quite
day.
selective, aren't you?
What are you going to do about the people you can't do anything?
Yeah, this should be good, man. I mean, of course she wants to frame it like that. You know, of course she wants to use any opportunity she can to try and make a point about Douglas Murray and everything that she believes that he represents. And I'm sure that she actually thinks that that's what she heard him say, but that's not what he said. And if you doubt that, you could literally read every single book or every single article the guy has ever written. You could watch every bit of tape that exists of Douglas Murray, and I promise you, he's never said anything even close to that. So this should be good.
About. Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to give them a pass? Or are you just going to enjoy beating up on the democracy?
I hate to have to interrupt you. There's something called democracy, though, isn't there? Elections.
For sure.
So I'm going to talk briefly about, my mother's experience as an immigrant, and I want to touch here on something that Mark Lamont Hill said, this power of education and telling people how refugees fit into the wider context of economic development. Here's why I'm very skeptical about that. Because when my mother arrived in the UK and her parents arrived in the UK, people still called them dirty packies. When she had graduated from Oxford University, she was still a brown person who was not seen as a citizen, right? So to what extent can we really sell this idea that being educated or fitting X, Y, and Z criteria is what you need to do as a refugee for people to humanize you? The inherent problem with these people is that they don't humanize you. You can't fulfill your oppressor's criteria so that they see you as human. So how do you humanize people?
Dehumanizing refugees, thank you very much. And with this, let me go to you, Douglas Murray. Because much of your argument, Douglas, seems to be about the us versus them, the fact that, we have our own values, our own Britishness, our own virtues, and they will come to our shores with their values, their traditions. You seem to almost suggest that they come to your countries with a lesser breed of values.
No, I don't think I...
Do you think this woman actually believes that in order to be properly welcoming to refugees or immigrants or whatever you want to call them, in order to be welcoming, you have to manipulate your own customs. I mean, she just said, how do you think they feel seeing people drink alcohol? What a goofy freaking question, man. Here's the thing. If you want people to feel all warm and fuzzy about not only welcoming people from around the world, but also picking up the bill to do it, going around demanding that they also change their way of life to make it happen, that doesn't really feel like a real winning message.
Said that at any point, and that's another time you've tried to put something in my mouth.
So when you talk about the difference in values, what do you suggest?
Look, first of all, I didn't say that. I said that there are challenges because we do know that there are challenges, and let's just be frank about this. I mean, for instance, I've been in the Gulf for the last week or so. I see more burqas in my home city of London than I have seen in the Gulf in recent days, certainly here in Doha. Now, I can't say I'm delighted by the sight of more and more burqas in London. Do I feel any hatred of the people who wear them? Of course not. Of course not. But I can't say I'm elated by it. And definitely there are times I think, what percentage of burqas in this area becomes like not that pleasant for everyone else?
But again, is it all down to burqas? Because again, you're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or showing up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
That you bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, there are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture, but let me just make the point. Every single society has certain aspects of it it doesn't want to give up. This one will. In Qatar, this one will. Everyone does. So please don't try to make this a kind of bigoted European thing. That would be a very dishonest way to. That would be a very dishonest way to represent
Just answer this question
debate.
directly if you can. Which of your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened by the arrival of refugees?
Freedom of speech. It's the first one. Oh, you think that's not a problem?
I mean,
you think that's not a problem?
But
you think? Sorry, no. Let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on that. It's very easy to snigger. It's very easy to snigger about this until you've had friends shot in a newspaper office. It's very easy to laugh about that until it's happened to people you know.
But I mean, we always end up in the same place. Who actually decides what is rational and what is well-founded? I mean, to me, it's just pure mathematics, man. If you can concede that only 1% of 1% of the people coming into the United States illegally are people that actually do wish to do it harm or do horrible things, then that means that just during the Biden administration alone, we have willfully welcomed and subsidized, probably paid the whole way, at least 1,000 people that wish to do harm and commit heinous acts inside the U.S. And I guess, that's probably an acceptable risk for a leftist in order to make themselves feel tolerant and accepting and enlightened and whatever they're seeking, right? But for the people that don't wish to take that risk, again, saying that they're being irrational or foolish, that isn't helpful at all. I mean, it's just pure math at this point, right?
An over-exaggeration, Douglas, do you think in the West, this fear of Islam or anything that looks so different to us?
No, I mean, the society I'm from is one of the most pluralistic and diverse societies on earth. You couldn't get a larger range of people of different backgrounds and ethnicities and languages than you have in Britain.
And
which is why, once again, if I may push back against this thing you are pushing, which is that these are sort of uniquely bigoted, unwelcoming societies.
Not at all.
The evidence on this part of the stage would suggest that Britain is not,
If anything, I'm giving you the chance to tell us, from your perspective, what you find threatening or not about refugees coming to England.
Let me answer that by broadening it, if I may. My suggestion would be, if we're to arrive at any kind of common understanding on this, is that we agree that, for instance, where there are people who pretend that everyone who arrives is a terrorist is barking mad, okay? We can agree with that, but don't laugh at people with serious concerns about serious security concerns either. Because,
like what?
Well, because we had this in 2015 when certain officials in Europe said the likelihood that anyone coming on the boats among the 1.5 million people who arrived in Germany are going to be violent in any way is total, xenophobic fantasy. And everyone laughed until people started letting off bombs, until, like in Ansbach in Germany, they just had a suicide bombing outside a wine bar, and it just stopped being quite so funny. So all I'm saying to you is, you can agree with me that people who say that most people arriving are going to be violent are ridiculous. Yes, but also don't claim it's ridiculous for people to have serious and sincere concerns about what is happening. Because if you do, there's no way anyone's going to arrive.
And that is the reality. Absolutely, Mark. How do you deal with this? It is a reality. This is, you know,
it's
the
a
way
reality.
some people feel.
No, it's a reality that people have sincere and serious concerns. It doesn't mean that the serious and sincere concerns are rational or well-founded. And I understand the idea that this often comes from the extreme, but in the United States, that extreme is the White House.
Yes.
Right? So, Donald Trump himself has been very clear in articulating the particular danger that Syrian refugees bring, despite the fact that they're vetted, despite the fact that they spend time in resettlement centers, but despite the fact that they're actually statistically much less likely to engage in acts of terrorism.
And it's connected to the Brexit propaganda again, just to scare people.
It's not actually the first generation. The first generation are often the ones who do want to integrate, and they just want to, at least my experience, you want to keep your head down, go to school, get a job, get going. It is that second generation that has grown up, born and grown up, and feels a sense of unbelonging because they're not reflected at all in the education, in the history books, in the art, in the culture, and they are demonized. And that's the community we have to be dealing with and recognizing.
Douglas,
and that's the pluralism that none of our societies.
I know you have something to say before I go to Nelufar.
We do have to address that. Every society on earth has difficulty integrating people, okay, from a very different background. Yes. It's always difficult. Again, I don't think we should fall into this idea that Europeans are uniquely bad at it. We've had to do a lot of absorbing very fast, and we've done most of it very damn well. And bits of it haven't gone well, and we've got to address that. But again, we can agree that there is gun violence in America from crazy people who think they need to be armed to walk to the supermarket. And that doesn't mean, well, okay, but that doesn't mean that people in France don't have their own specific security concerns as well. And what I'm urging you to do is, let's not look at this just from an American point of view. In Europe, it is a serious security concern we have now, and we are trying to deal with it, and that shouldn't be laughed at.
The point that he's making, I think, is that the West really are the most tolerant people on the planet, and they actually do a pretty damn terrific job of welcoming people. But the point is, assimilating anyone, especially millions and millions and millions of people, it's not going to be the smoothest process in the world, right? But the mistake that the tolerant leftists like to make is they measure us against some never before accomplished fantasy of how they believe things should be or could be or need to be or whatever. They never ever measure it against how things actually are. And if you measure us against any other nation or group on the planet, there's no contest. I mean, there's no freaking argument. There isn't even anything to talk about, you know? We do more and we help more than probably the entire rest of the world combined. But there's no pleasing the Marxists because, again, being pleased and getting to whatever goal, whatever arbitrary goal they've set out, that's never, ever been the point.
My question is to you, Douglas. So you talked about us serving justice, and do you think it's judicious for these people in Britain, for example, you talked about how Britain is giving aid to these countries in Africa. It's judicious for them to give this much money to these countries, but without even listening to their needs. So this only contributes to the white savior complex that is currently a big issue in
this
Africa.
whole notion of...
The white savior complex, again, man, geez. Again, pleasing people or even helping people, that was never, ever the point. I mean, one of the questions, if you remember, was essentially, how dare you even mention the fact that we give billions and billions in foreign aid? The real story is that much of that aid comes back, you know, is interest bearing, which means that all these poor people in all these struggling nations full of all these great and worthy governments are really sending all their money back to service debt. You know, nothing's free, right? No. And their argument was, no wonder people are fleeing. They're just following their money west. And now we have another question, basically the opposite. I mean, how dare you mention the billions in aid? You didn't even ask us what we wanted or what we need. You just sent money. You bought us socks, basically is what they're saying. You bought us socks, and nobody wants to get socks. I mean, you can't possibly win with these people. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, just like you said.
Charity. as opposed to policy.
Well, there is a saying we have, damned if you do and damned if you don't. If it's the case that if we don't give aid, we'd be accused of not giving aid, and if we do give aid, it's a white savior complex. I mean, we can all give aid better, for sure, and I just gave, in my opening remarks, what I think was a serious suggestion for one very good use of aid, which is to prioritize it in the region and in the neighboring countries of places people are fleeing from. But, I mean, as I say, I would refuse as well to see the multifarious problems that exist in your own home country and sadly across the continent of Africa. I refuse to say that that's, because of foreign aid only. It's so many things have gone wrong there, and you know that better than I do.
Honestly, at this point, I mean, he's got to be wondering what the hell he's even doing there, man. I mean, the entire room is full of whiny, complaining leftists who have literally zero clue what they're there even talking about, right? They have no idea what caused any of the problems. They have no idea what to do about any of the problems. I mean, all they know is that there are problems, and it's the fault of the white saviors in the West. I mean, that's exactly what it's like, man. Trying to talk to a modern day leftist is exactly what that must feel like. I mean, these are cultural Marxists. They are not here to solve any problems. They are here to be the problem. I mean, whether they know it or not, that is their purpose. They are the problem. And luckily, we're starting to wise up. We're starting to learn the game, and we're starting to learn how to beat them at their own game. But that's just my take, guys. I thought you'd enjoy seeing that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you haven't already, be a part of our growth. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Most importantly, share the channel. I'll see you in the next one.